21 years old, whatever, 22, fresh out of college. I fly into through Warsaw, and they drove me straight to a Greek restaurant where there was 5 Ukrainians, 6 Poles, and 1 Brit. And they were all waiting for me, but in front of everybody, there was each person had a pitcher of grapefruit juice and a bottle of vodka. 30 minutes to 45 minutes, each went around and made a toast. And we toasted to whatever, health and happiness. And there was about 18 shots in me in the first hour. And that's when I learned what international business was all about to a certain degree.
There's something like 1 million podcasts globally, but so many seem to limit their guests to talking about just 1 or 2 aspects of their personality or life experience. Here at The Practical Optimist, we challenge every guest to explore their whole selves, focusing on the intersection of leadership and life. I'm your host, Ken Schmidt, founder and CEO of Turning Point Executive Search and author of The Practical Optimist, an entrepreneurial journey through life's turning points. Today's guest, Greg Dummer, will amaze you with his 30-plus years of international business experience, having traveled to almost 70 countries. He'll talk very candidly about becoming a triathlete as a way to channel his hyper-competitive personality, especially during his 2 years as a stay-at-home dad, raising 3 daughters. And you'll also hear why we need to remember that the whole world doesn't operate like we do here in America. International School is now in session as Greg Dummer takes us through the intersection of leadership and life. Greg, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really happy to have you on the podcast. I know this is actually our second take, so it's great to have a chance to talk to you yet again. So I'm joined today by Greg Dummer, who is the Managing Director of Strategic Growth over at Envoy Global. So thank you for joining us today.
Ken, it's a pleasure. Twice. I mean, I'd do it 3 times just to get a chance to talk to you. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, now we both have the professional mics in front of us. I know our listeners can't see it, but it looks great. We both look really good right now.
Absolutely.
So thanks for joining. Thanks for joining for sure. I know we have a lot to get to and chat about, and you've got a very, very interesting background and upbringing, having had a lot of international exposure, both in terms of travel, but also work-wise. So let's kind of get right into it. So as you know, this podcast is called The Practical Optimist, and I use that definition because it describes what I get from my mom's side on the practical, very kind of analytical, think things through, don't get kind of out over your skis kind of a characteristic. And then my dad's side, which is more optimistic and very visionary and a bit pie in the sky at times. So it's a nice blending of the two to help me manage my own career. So I'm curious about a few words or phrase that you might use to describe yourself.
Well, first, a plug for your book. I'm starting to read Practical Optimist. I got a copy from you, and I'm reading them. I'm on the airplanes, and it's a wonderful book. I'm really enjoying it. So,
well, thank you.
First of all, I appreciate
that.
Plug.
That's great. I appreciate that. Feel free to show it to the people, the pastors that are next to you as well.
I will. Absolutely. And then, but I think to answer your question, and it's a really good question. I feel like people should be asking that question every 5 or 10 years, because I think it may change, or maybe it doesn't. But if it does, it kind of brings you back to who you really are and trying to level set you. I think for me, the 2 words that I think describe me or what I want to be the best version of myself are practical optimist is a passionate growth. And, passion, I think, is a fuel of life for me, and for better or for worse at times. But I think passion really motivates me to be the best person I can be and to push myself. And growth is very similar to passion, but it's really, I believe strongly that people should always try to grow in life, grow in all facets of their life. And whether that's personal, spiritually, whether that's family, whether it's work, growth is a big part of what I am and what I try to do. And so I think those 2 together, I feel like were best descriptions of me.
That's great. No, I love that. Yeah, I've had such a wide variety of words and descriptors coming from our different guests, and I love hearing what each person is going to say about themselves. It's just a great discussion point. So thanks for sharing that. Well, and speaking of growth, I mean, it's obviously you chose that word for a reason, as you described. But the growth that you've had over your career has been tremendous, right? In terms of not just only in terms of breadth of responsibility, but also growth from a standpoint of big company, small company, consulting versus working. Being a stay-at-home dad for a while versus being in a full-time role. A lot of different things that have played into that. Now, remind me again, did you grow up in a family that was full of sales leaders or folks that were in traditional corporate business?
Yeah, so I think To a certain degree, yeah. My dad, we worked for a company called my hometown Red Wing. So he worked for a company called Red Wing Shoe Company, and he ran their international team group for years. And so, when he started it was just himself. And I think whereas he worked for a fairly larger company in Minnesota, but at the same time, he built the international team and built the whole market for the company. And I think, that was back in the day where there was no cell phones. There was a telex was the only way to communicate. And he'd be gone 3 or 4 weeks at a time building this market through relationships. And I feel like he was fearless. He went around the world, um, places, and he's from a small town, a farming town in Minnesota. And here he was in Nigeria and Abu Dhabi and, all these countries around the world. So I always watched that and admired him, seeing the world and experiencing that. And, I'm sure that he must have been very uncomfortable multiple times in his career, finding himself in situations. And for me, I just thought it was just wonderful. So that was a big thing there. And my mom, she was a stay-at-home mom for much of my life, but at the same time, she was always fearless in trying new things where she'd be, kayaking in the middle of Lake Superior, going around islands with a couple girlfriends, or deciding to walk 100 miles to another town. So she had that bit of her persona as well. So I think the two together probably led me to this direction. So I think, where we could be perceived as being small town America, I think I was brought up with aspirations that are much bigger than, it may have looked like.
That's amazing. Well, speaking of, travel, I remember, growing up in San Diego, and when my dad traveled to Los Angeles, I thought, wow, what an exotic place. Tell me all about the faraway land. I can't imagine.
That could be scary, Los Angeles.
That's true. It is a different planet sometimes, depending upon where you are up there. But I can't imagine. So do you remember hearing stories about your dad's travels through Africa or different parts of the world?
Oh yeah, it was a big part of our life. I think, the thing is he traveled quite a bit, but he always was there when it mattered the most. And I think I always admire that about him. But yeah, he would spend time, like in Nigeria, and he'd be telling us about it. And I think he was held hostage in his hotel room for 3 days while there was a coup. And, stories like that, which I don't think he wanted to share, but we probably overheard as we're listening to him talk to my mother. And the experiences, in Brunei, meeting, people who are close to the Sultan, and all these different things were, and then, the only way we got information and they encouraged us was opening up our book, the Encyclopedia Britannica books, and we'd have to look it up. And then also, I think we had a lot of visitors always. It was an open house at our house. So whenever somebody from out of town, from out of the country came into Red Wing, Minnesota, there weren't a lot of places to have dinner and whatnot. So we always invited them over to our house. And I think they really wanted to experience what a true, American household was like. So we broke down a lot of barriers there. But that was a great opportunity to be exposed to new cultures and new countries and learn a lot.
So did you get a chance to do much traveling when you were young, or did that really come later on in life when you got into your professional life?
A little bit of both. When I was young, my dad brought us each on a couple trips. So I spent a summer in Egypt, and it was a great opportunity. Like my dad had traveled in Middle East and, some countries like Saudi Arabia, and where it probably is not the best place to bring a child. So he would, I stayed with the family, and, I had the time of my life. He gave me, which I don't know how much it was worth, but it seemed like it was a lot of money. And there was a club or something that was in the neighborhood. So I went there with all this money, and I made the friends. I bought them all Fantas and candy bars. And by the end of it, I had like best friends in Egypt. And then, and through Europe as well, he brought us in a couple trips. So that was a great eye-opening. Just, it really expanded your horizons, just being exposed to that.
And you grew up with two sisters, is that right?
Yep, I have two sisters. I'm right in the middle, and I tell my middle daughter, I was the meat and cheese of the sandwich.
I love that. That's great. Well, at least now you have three also of your own, so you can help to understand what they're going through, and then they can
Absolutely.
also live through the experiences that you had as well. Wow, that's great. So when you were younger then, and you were exposed to all this international travel and different stories, different cultures, did it ever occur to you that maybe that might be a professional direction that you took with your own career, was that international path?
Absolutely. I think that's exactly what I wanted to do. I had globes, and I was constantly looking at the globe and looking at different countries and wondering what they're like. And, interesting, I had my first opportunity for international when I was out of college. My first job was at a community bank in Minnesota, and all my friends hadn't gotten jobs yet, and so they were out on the lakes having fun. And here I was sitting in a suit and a strip mall working at a bank, and I'm like, this is not for me. So I'll never forget. So one of the families that I stayed with when I was in Egypt, he actually worked for my father, and he was opening up the European office, and he needed help basically. So he called me. His name was Ali, and he called me, and he's like, Greg, your dad doesn't know about this, but I really need some help. Would you be willing to come over? And I hear that you're between jobs. Would you be willing to come over to Europe and to Switzerland where they had offices and help me out for 6 months? I'll deal with the details, but basically I need you to help, carry my bags. We've got a whole warehouse in Amsterdam or in Holland that has shoes that we need to inventory. And would you be willing? And I said, well, sign me up. I'm there. So that was my first foray into Europe and into international was that. And soon after I was there, it was probably this 2 months after we were really trying to get into the Eastern Europe market. And there's a really big trade show in Poland. So this would be 1993. So the wall was relatively, coming down recently, and there was not a lot of infrastructure or hotels in the small town called Poznan in Poland. And my boss was supposed to go there because we were trying to get distributors that were the same distributors for Timberland and Nike and all these big shoe companies. And so he couldn't go. He was Egyptian. He wasn't able to get a visa in time. So he says, Greg, can you get to Poland? And I said, sure. So 21 years old, whatever, 22, fresh out of college, I fly into through Warsaw into Poznan. And when I get there, my flight was like a couple hours delayed, and there was no hotel. So they sent my baggage onward to another place. I'd be staying above some old pensioners, a lady's house. And they drove me straight to a Greek restaurant where there was 5 Ukrainians, 6 Poles, and 1 Brit. And they were all waiting for me. But in front of everybody, there was each person had a pitcher of grapefruit juice and a bottle of vodka. And within 30 minutes to 45 minutes, each went around and made a toast. And we toasted to whatever health and happiness. And there was about 18 shots in me in the first hour. And that's when I learned what international business was all about to a certain degree. And I must have passed the muster because I think I got a decent order with that. And once my boss saw that, he goes, all right, Greg, how about this country? And so I kind of expanded based on that. Yeah.
Do you remember anything else about that night after all those shots?
I didn't even remember the whole weekend. I do remember going home and wondering, whoa, that was something else. And I realized that the cheap Busch Light draft and whatever I was drinking in college doesn't muster up to Russian vodka.
That's probably more, almost as much alcohol that you had all throughout college, just in that one night. Yeah,
absolutely.
With a lot more pressure to drink it and hold it down.
Yes, absolutely.
So, do you remember your dad's reaction when you told him about your first international, stint?
Yeah, he just laughed. Because obviously, I think he'd been there many times in his life, and I think he. Number one, I think he appreciated that I told him about it because I was debating that, number one. And number two, I think he realized that's, in the end, that's kind of how a lot of relationships, that's how, every culture is different, and it doesn't mean you have to drink alcohol to have a relationship. But I think that's one way for them to break down barriers and be open and honest. And the fact that I could hang with them and that they, through the whole process, they started to trust me enough where they wanted to make an order for our shoes was big. And I think he was very proud of that because I think it's, not everybody could do that and not everybody would want to do that. And I think it was, I think he was proud in that fact.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's one of the things I wish I had done earlier on in my career. I didn't have a chance to study overseas for a semester abroad or any of that. I didn't really travel at all until 2015 outside of the U.S. other than Vancouver, Canada, but that's really not
right.
all that different. But I think having that exposure at an earlier age, especially, not only does it help you understand that everybody does things in a different way. There's different actual customs, but also just basic things like handshake and eye contact and the way that you address somebody. All those things really help to I think expand your horizons, but also to make you realize, hey, we all do things in a different way. And, there's different ways to do business. And so it makes you, I think, that much more empathetic towards your customer base because now you see that people are just different wherever you go.
Yeah. And I would add to that, you're right. Everybody does things different ways. And, if you have a US-centric mindset, you think that yours is the right way and theirs is the wrong way, and that's not necessarily the case. But also at the same time, when you experience them, you realize everybody is also very similar in the sense that they all want the same things. They want health, security, happiness. They want their family to be, loved, and there's so many things that they do want. And I think once you can get over, the hurdle that, people look differently, they eat differently, they do all these things at the core, people are very similar. And I think you break down those barriers and you really understand that.
Now I know you played 5 different sports in school, so you have been a pretty competitive individual from a very young age. So to that point of working internationally, did you find that you had to kind of dial back that, quote unquote American competitiveness that maybe it probably didn't exist to the same extent overseas?
I think so. Yeah, especially, I mean, I think I think people expect it from Americans. So I think people can kind of play Americans, especially back then. I think, especially if you were to go to Asia at the time, especially Japan, I think, they look at Americans, and, Americans, when we went to do business in Asia, in many cases, we would be like, oh, we got to go there. We got to get the deal done before we get back. So they would sit there and they just watch us unfold and unwind. And, the Asians, and specifically in Japan at the time in the 80s and 90s, they would, it was all about like when you fly in, they'd be like, oh, we're going to take you to go see a temple. And
right,
you're like,
sure.
No, I don't have time to see the temple. Let's talk about the contract.
I'm here to do a deal. Yeah, right.
I want to do a deal. And I think, they're like, we want to know who you are, how you operate, and then also I think they gamed us to a certain degree because they're like, we know that your flight's on Friday and we know that you're going to start giving us concessions and this and that to get a deal done. So I think, the American mindset going there was troubled. I mean, it was not successful. So I think, the people who knew the business in Asia, and I think over time realized that you have to maybe go back 2 or 3 times and you have to be willing to put in the relationship. They were starting to respect that. Then over time, you start to get concessions from them. And I think, but that's because they respect you and your business acumen. So that's the very hard part for Americans, especially if you're very aggressive and you're type A personalities, which we have. And then you're dealing with the people that are Confucianistic and they have a very different community decision-making process that not one person can make a decision. So Americans definitely have a lot to learn. And I think, it's changed a lot now because I think Americans have become much more global. And then in most cases, and also the rest of the world has become much more just with social media and whatnot, have their cultures have changed as well. And I think we're probably meeting somewhere in the middle.
No, that's a good point. I'm part of a global organization of executive search firms around the world, about 34 different countries, a group called Talentor. And I just think, I don't think we Americans realize how much we take for granted the fact that pretty much the whole world speaks English.
Yes.
Right? I get on that call and there's, like I said, 45 to 50 people, once a month, and we meet in person a couple of times a year. And, there are people from, all corners of the globe, and everybody speaks English. And I constantly just thank them. I say, oh my gosh, I'm so fortunate to be from the US, where obviously English is our primary language. But the fact that everybody does that, I mean, that's a really huge advantage, if you will, that we have, that everybody else is kind of acclimated to our way of speaking. It just helps with business, but we take it for granted, and we shouldn't. We really should be more appreciative and acknowledge the fact that, hey, this should not be expected of everybody out there, and we need to put a lot more effort forward as Americans to really show that appreciation.
I completely agree. And I think we also, I think, they respect, they wouldn't expect an American in most cases to know and understand another language as well as they would. But at the same time, making an effort is really important. So if you have a Berlitz phrase book and you learn a couple greetings or please or thank you or something, cheers or whatever, I think it goes a long ways, because you're right. They don't expect Americans to do it. And we're very fortunate. But I think we can make another effort to try to meet them somewhere in the middle. And I think people are starting to do that too.
No, I agree. And also, just for our listeners out there, so as I'm talking to Greg right now, there are literally 2 different maps behind him, which I know we always kind of joke about when you and I chat, but so the international flavor is in your DNA, but it's also literally on the walls behind you too, within your house. So have you kind of tried to impart some of that international flavor, if you will, on your 3 girls?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I want them to realize the world's a lot bigger than it is. And we've taken them on some international trips, and we're going to be in Italy for a few weeks this year as well. And I think part of that is really just so Well, we want them to do some research above, they'll probably do it the night before, but we really want them to be intentional about, knowing where they are and having some history behind it and everything. That's a huge part of I think their growth and learning. But also I think, it's just, I think we live in a neighborhood where there are people coming from all different countries. And I think, they're very accepting of it, and they're very curious. And I think part of it is that, we love trying different foods, and they're kind of fearless in terms of learning new cultures. So to me, that's really important. And we've tried to encourage that growing up, and to not just think that it's just US and it's just us, that there's so many other wonderful cultures out there that they can explore.
Exactly. Right. Right. And again, making them kind of a citizen of the world, as they say, as well, whether they end up, in a career where there is international activity or not, just having that awareness and that knowledge of getting outside of our San Diego, Southern California bubble, it goes a very, very long way for sure.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Hey, by the way, thanks again for listening. And if you like what you're hearing in today's discussion, please subscribe to our channel or leave us a review. And we'd love for you to share this episode with your friends and family. Now back to our show. Now, so did you then? So you were at Red Wing for a while. You were selling shoes. You were doing all the work over there in Poland and elsewhere. Did you then, did you kind of set in your mind at that point that you really liked this international flavor? So that was kind of the goal, in the next couple of steps in your career, also.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, there was at the time, and it probably still is really highly rated. There was a school called Thunderbird. It's in Arizona, and it's an international business school. And so at the time, they were the number one in the world for international business. And I said, that's where I want to go. So I applied and I got in. And so I was there, and it was in Glendale, Arizona at the time for 2 years. And being there was just absolutely amazing, because I think at the time there was maybe 75 different countries represented there of students. And all of them had, different clubs, different exposure, and when you get your MBA, basically the whole curriculum behind it is all about group projects and working together and being able to do things together. And it's hard enough with a bunch of Americans trying to do that, but then you have other different cultures trying to do it and trying to work out projects and have a deliverable you have to get by the next day. That was great, but it also was really important in terms of if this is your career, this is how it needs to be done, working with a multicultural group. So that was a wonderful springboard for me. And then I spent a semester in China taking classes in Chinese, finance classes and whatnot. And it was between Beijing and Shanghai. So that was a great opportunity to live in another country and take classes in another country. So from there, I did get a job where I ran an international sales team for what is now a very large company. And being very young, I had to I traveled the world. I think at the time I went to 60 some countries with that company alone, working with our distributors. It was a very old company initially called Rockwell. And then it became British Tire and Rubber, and now it's part of Schneider Electric. So I was doing a job that was probably should have been done by somebody 15 years older, but I was fearless, and I went out there and for about 3 or 4 years, I probably flew 300,000 miles a year.
Wow. And now, did you take time and do your MBA full time, or were you still working during at Thunderbird?
I did it full time, and
okay.
I would, if I had a chance, I would do it all over again, because I was still in my mid to late 20s, and it was kind of like your last hurrah before life was going to happen again. So it was a very unique environment. I think if I had the opportunity for a company to pay for it, I would have maybe done that as well. But I certainly had a lot of fun, and it was a great experience.
That's amazing. Wow. I always, I'm very impressed by folks. Obviously, as a recruiter, I see all kinds of resumes and backgrounds, and the folks that go back to get their graduate degree, several years or sometimes 5, 8, 10 years after their undergrad. It's always, very impressive. I mean, the work ethic alone, going back to school after having been out for a while, that whole routine is a bit foreign to you, but also then switching gears from the corporate environment and that hustle and bustle to then the routine, if you will, and the focus and just kind of the intensity, if you will, of a full-time MBA program. That's not easy to make that transition.
No, it's not. But then it becomes refreshing too. And I also think it's actually, I think that's the best way to do it, because when you get your MBA or graduate school, probably in any different type of vocation, you want to bring life experiences to it. It adds color. It adds a lot to it. So if you're just coming out of college, you're doing it, it's like you don't have any real world experience to add. So I think it's really important to do it, but at the same time, you go from making money and to not having money, and I think that's the hard part too. When you take on loans, so you have to really
when
believe
you
in what
start
you're doing.
adulting.
Yeah, then you start, yeah, exactly.
That's great. And so I know that you had a number of job changes throughout your career, but being in sales, that's not that unusual, right? Where people tend to kind of go where the opportunity is for growth, for excitement and engagement around their product or service, but also for more financial opportunity as well. Did you and as you got into your early 30s, did you start to think about, okay, I know where I want to end up. My goal is to get to X, Y, Z. Did it start to take shape at all at that point?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you ask these questions, and I think there's two things when I look back and advice that I would give to somebody just getting started in their career. I think I would have benefited a bit by being a bit more patient. I think I was lucky. I had a lot of opportunities that presented themselves to me, and there's times where when you have a job, it's not always like perfect. And I think sometimes you need to just, grind it out and you see the bigger picture and continue with it. Where early on in my career, I may have left because I'm like, you know what? They're never going to change. I have this opportunity. So I think, that'd be a big thing. It's, someone told me, run towards something, not away from something. And I feel like, there was probably running away a few times in my life because I was like, I don't need to deal. So I think that was one big thing. And then also I feel like every time I must have had some value set internally, because every time I got to a point where I was out of whack, where I was working so much, where I didn't have any balance in my life, I kind of sabotaged my career. And I think I had opportunities where I could have been in done a much bigger job, and I could have been in Hong Kong and spent an expat there for years, and I didn't do it. Or there's a lot of different opportunities where I didn't do it. And I feel like as I got older, where I once wanted to be just a CEO, that was the most important thing in the world. I feel like now as I get older, other things became more important, and so it just kind of inversed. And I do remember early on in my career, this is a very interesting story. I was on a flight out of LA to Malaysia, and it was a Malaysian Airlines, and I was able to get upgraded in first class to Kuala Lumpur. And so I'm sitting there, and this is during the dot-com era. I hadn't moved to San Francisco yet. I was still living in Western Pennsylvania. But I was sitting next to a gentleman who was probably mid to late 50s. I was probably 29. I was wearing shorts and probably a t-shirt and looking like I'm some dot-com millionaire. And he was sitting there, and we both looked at each other and made some niceties, and we were drinking champagne and all that nice stuff. And we take off, and finally he's like, I gotta know. He was, tell me about yourself. Like what do you do? And he was very, very curious. And I said, well, I work for this company and I'm running international sales. And then and he goes, well, why do you want to do that? And he kept asking me, why do you want to do this? Why do you want to do this? And I didn't really have a good answer. And he says, well, let me tell you a little bit about myself. He goes, and I won't say the company, but it was a Fortune 50 company. He was the CEO. And he goes, I'm so-and-so, and I'm on my third wife. I'm an alcoholic, and I'm really unhappy. And he goes, and I look at you and I see a lot of you and me. And he just said, he goes, just be careful, know why you're doing what you're doing, and be careful not just to get to the next level, but know that there's other things in your life. And he goes, had I do it all over, I would have done it differently. So that resonated, and I never forget. I was on. So then here I'm in Kuala Lumpur. Then I went to Thailand, and I went to the Philippines. I went to all these countries, and I was just lonely. And I was like, all the things that I was like feeling kind of came to fruition. And about 3 weeks later, I quit my job, and then I moved to San Francisco. That was during the dot-com era, and that's when everyone was making millions and working for eBay. And so I'm like, I got to go there. But that experience always left a mark in me, because I felt like the pursuit of moving up for the sake of getting to that position, maybe it's fool's gold. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's not always that. And you see somebody who made the pinnacle and he wasn't happy, and his children didn't know them, and he had bad health. And he's like, I wouldn't trade that. You have a chance to do something different.
That's really, I mean, the fact that he was willing to share that with you. But I would imagine if it was me, I'd think in the first 5 seconds of him sharing, I'd think, dude, why are you telling me this?
Exactly.
We
Yeah, I
just
know.
met.
Like,
You're telling me about being on your third wife, and your kids don't know you. You tell me that you're an alcoholic. I mean,
I know.
nice to meet you. Also, that's a
I
little
know
off-putting to
exactly, and
say
we're
the
doing that
least.
while we're drinking. So I felt like even I was like it's
Yeah.
more interesting. However,
But the
I
reason
feel like
behind it, the motivation, right? And his desire to want to, kind of impart his experience on you and maybe help you to avoid the mistakes, the pitfalls that he made,
you're absolutely right. I think
Amazing.
that's yeah.
So speaking of that, so I'm not sure this coincided with talking to this Fortune 50 CEO, but so you met your wife, and speaking of
Yes.
balance, she is a pediatric cardiologist, right? If I have that
Correct.
correct.
Yes.
So both of you have very demanding careers and a lot going on, and 3 daughters and all these things. So how do you maintain that balance? How do you keep the words of that CEO top of mind when things get so crazy where you're both, you and your wife are working, all hours of the week?
Yeah, that's a good question, and we still constantly deal with it. But I think early on, I was still traveling crazy internationally when I first met her, and then she was doing her fellowship at Harvard for 4 years, and so she was working 100 hours a week as a fellowship, and and I was commuting every day or every week from Boston to Philadelphia and back, and I finally says enough. If we want to make this work, this was a priority for me. There needs to be a change, and at this point in our lives, she can't make that change because she's got to see this through. So I changed careers completely. So I gave up a career where I could have been, like I said, I think the time I had an opportunity to be in Dublin or Hong Kong and be stationed there, and I said, I can't do that. So I started to work for a couple startups, and they didn't make it, but I wanted to have something that's less. And so then we actually moved our family to Minnesota, and I chose a career that to raise a family. My family was still there, and so my wife was building her career, and I kind of just let my career where that was there. I took a pivot, and then I started in a completely different industry where my travel was 6 or 7 counties around the Twin Cities, and it was a very different career. I had to build it up from ground up. It was a commission-based type of opportunity. But I realized that we had kids now, and one of us, we wanted to have somebody be there. So I completely changed my career at the time. And so much so that one of the jobs where, during the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, our owners brought the salespeople together and says, we want to keep you, but we can't pay you. And I'm like, that's going to be a problem. That was a week before our second daughter was born.
Oh,
So
wow.
that's when I became a stay-at-home dad for 2.5 years. While, I had opportunities, it was a tough job market. I'm sure in your industry, but
Yeah.
I did get a decent amount of opportunities, but they're all international, what I did in the past. So I became, handled poopy diapers and drove minivans, and very humbling, but it was but I think to me, I actually, the CEO, the people the experiences I had, it was the right thing to do at the time. And, you realize that it's not all about money and fame and fortune. It's about, raising a family. And I'm not certain we do it that well, but we try our hardest.
Well, kudos to you. I mean, making one of those major pivots in a career in a lifetime is one thing, but doing it twice, only in the course of several years, that's it's commendable for you and your wife to really make that decision and that commitment to your family. Also, it'd be very easy to say, we're gonna get a nanny, and I'm gonna continue to travel internationally and do all these things, and that's great. There's nothing against having a nanny, but it's a sacrifice, and then there's only so many hours in the day, right? And then you do run the risk of growing up with your kids growing up not knowing you as well as they could if you were willing to make that change. But that is no easy feat by any stretch. So I really commend you for that. It's amazing. I don't know if I would have the fortitude to do that.
Yeah, I'm not certain I would in retrospect, but we did it at the time.
It all worked out, right? It all worked out.
Yeah.
Well, we have this, obviously there's this cliche out there in recruiting, especially. It's that nobody on their deathbed said, "God, I wish I had worked more hours." Right.
Right.
Instead, it's, I wish I had more time with my family, or saw my kids more, or, I saw my spouse more, whatever it was. But, work is always going to be there. No matter how many hours in the day you work, there's more. Right.
Absolutely.
But, there's only so much time you have with your family because they have their own lives as well. So you've got to make kind of a bit of a decision at some point, not to give up one completely necessarily, but to be able to have that balance and be aware of both areas needing to kind of, share that time.
You're absolutely right.
Interesting. Okay, I got you. So now that then you did that for a couple of years. You were a stay-at-home dad. How was that in terms of the going again, that hyper competitive, nature, playing all kinds of sports. I think this is when you got into competing in triathletes, right? Around the same
Yeah.
time frame.
Yeah. I mean, it was, to answer your first question, it was very humbling. I think, you're right. I am a type A personality, and I've always, as much as I try not to, you still can't help sometimes defining, or just the world around you kind of defines success differently than what it really should be. And it's difficult to not get caught up in that sometimes. So I feel like I was licking my wounds for a while as you're sitting there and you see successful people going to successful places, and you're, like I said, wiping poopy diapers, and your kids are taking naps twice a day, and you're by yourself. And, most of the people that you're around are stay-at-home moms who you're not really part of that community as well. So I feel like that was hard at the time, to be honest with you. I think, my wife was very supportive, but I think at the same time, there was a bit of jealousy too, because there's nothing more that she wanted to do. But it was very hard for her to take that completely after training for 15 years to be able to do that. So, that was a tough part of our life, but I think it was a great opportunity in our life. And I think, our girls, they may not recognize it now, but I think they know deep down inside,
For sure, yeah. Well, and as they get older as well and more independent, it may not come out in a very clear, obvious way, but that you had a hand in laying that foundation because you did make that sacrifice and you did put, family before, a title on a business card, which a lot of people, aren't willing to do.
Yeah. And then your second question in terms of like triathlons, I think, yeah, I needed an outlet. And I think, I have a very competitive personality, and I think it manifests itself some way, shape, or form if I don't have an outlet. So I think somebody asked me to go on a bike ride, or there was going to be a long bike fondo or whatever they call it. And he's like, would you like to do it with me? And I said, sure. At the time I had like the equivalent of a Schwinn, 15-year-old Schwinn 10 speed. But I started to ride, and then I started to see other people riding, and they were like triathletes. I'm like, well, that looks interesting. So I kind of to pursue it. And I did my first race. I did everything wrong. But at the same time, I saw the community, and I think I told you the first time I was situated next to a person who, in my first race, we had our bikes racked together, and he just was telling me the ropes, how to do it, was very supportive. He ended up winning it, and he didn't care that I probably I don't know what, I didn't do well, put it that way, but I finished. And then I just saw that whole environment and the community of the triathlon community. And I said, this is wonderful. And I think it's what I needed at the time. Just, everybody, all shapes, forms, or sizes are welcome there. And I think everybody's supportive because they know that it takes more than just a single sport to do. It takes intentionally training for 3 activities to get there. And everybody has their own personal reason for doing it and why they do it. And I think that's the beauty of it. And when you get to take time to meet people pre-year, post-race and learn their stories, it was very uplifting. So I felt like for me, that was a very good outlet. And then it was just a great way just to be around really cool people.
That's pretty amazing. So you've had a few different encounters of random strangers that really helped to shape you, whether it was the CEO or the person that you were racing with. I mean, who knows if you were paired up with somebody or next to somebody who was just a total jerk, right? And was really talking down to you as an amateur and what are you doing here and get out of my way. And, everybody's in it for themselves. You probably would have had a completely different perspective and idea, and maybe you wouldn't have stuck with it.
I think you're probably right. That easily could have happened. And I'm glad it didn't, but that easily could have happened.
Yeah, exactly. That's amazing. Wow. I'm glad you've had some good people come to your life as well. And to that point, actually, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, having worked in so many different types of companies and different size companies, from the really large one that you mentioned early on to small startups and everything in between, have you had and or have you been in a more formalized mentorship scenario or situation? I know for me, the senior partner that I supported when I worked at Hydric and Struggles is still my mentor to this day. He's been in the industry for quite a while in executive search. And he's just an amazing individual, Ron Jervis. And it wasn't really a formalized, I'm going to be your mentor today, Ken, kind of a thing, but it just developed that way. But I got so much value out of it. And I've tried to share that with other folks that I support, either that are earlier in their career or that are more senior, but just, sharing what little I know. I'm curious about yourself. Have you had that kind of mentorship, scenario or dynamic also?
Yeah, it wasn't formal by any means, but I think there was just some people that, that's they like to do that, or they saw something in me, or yes. So I did. And that I definitely benefit by that. And I also try to do the same as well. my job right now is a lot of mentorship and working with people that are up and coming, and they probably get tired of hearing me talking and telling my stories. But I think that's my favorite part of what I do. Is, there's work and there whatever, but when you can just see people and their eyes open and you can impart wisdom and you can share, what you did well and how you failed, and just, personalize your experience. I think, if you can give them anything to push them forward and to help them soar, which is what I'd love to do, it's really important. I think companies now are having more and more formal mentorship programs. I think that's great, but I do think at the same time, once they become formal, the most successful ones almost just organically become a true friendship and become a true, the formal part really gets them going. And then there's this whole, I guess it's still formal mentorship, but the informal part is because it's, it takes a lot of effort on both sides to be able to do it. But I think both gain a lot through the process.
No, I agree completely. Yeah, I remember when my first corporate, quote unquote, corporate role out of college was at Enterprise Rent-A-Car. And I used to say to my wife all the time, I learned so much more at the happy hours or the dinners after, we close up the office and we go out. That's where the real kind of quote unquote training came from.
Yes.
Or real insights into what it's like being a manager or a leader or those kinds of things. And it was informal, but I knew enough. I didn't know a lot back then, but I knew enough to say, hey, let's take advantage of these opportunities when they do come up to learn kind of off the clock, if you will.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think even if it's not a formal program, but if somebody that you respect and admire asks if you want help, I think you need to take them up on it. And, I think some great things can happen on both sides. So I think people do want to help people that really want to help, that want to improve.
I agree. Yeah. And I wish more organizations would actually invest in rotational programs, or even, like I said, informal groups that would eventually lead to a more organic mentorship type program. So you get different exposure around different departments or different divisions in a company, rather than being stuck in one role for a number of years. I think, again, back to our discussion earlier about the international flavor and getting exposure to other cultures, it's the same thing inside of a company, right? You get exposed, you might be in sales, but if you get exposure to marketing and product development and the operations side, it just helps you to be a better overall business professional, because you understand that what happens in sales has a ripple effect, right? Yes. And no department is better than the others, better or worse than the others. A company can't thrive unless all of them are working together and in tandem. Otherwise, you're going to go in circles.
Yep, you're absolutely right.
What are the conversations that you and your wife are having with your girls now about all things we talked about, mentorship and learning and just experiencing different things in life? Have you gotten to a point yet where you're having more of those discussions?
Yeah, we are. I mean, our oldest is starting to look at colleges, so I think there's a whole process that goes through that. And I think, one of the things that I think maybe I complain more than anybody is that, in sports growing up, there was sports and there was life too. And now one of the problems about sports, especially with kids, it's so organized and it's so like, it's all in. If you want to be in soccer starting 5th grade, you have to be, or even younger, you have to be in a competitive sport team. You got to travel. You got to spend all your time doing that. And I think that bothers me, because I feel like kids should be doing that. Then they should be able to be exposed to other things too. And then it's not ours. And even just with sports, being exposed to 4, 5, 6 different sports and having fun doing it. Now, I think a lot of kids get burnt out physically and mentally, the way that sports are, I think. And then also it's like kids don't have enough time where you can just be creative and explore your passions. I think, it's like, you go to school, then you got your homework, and then you got to go to practice, and you got to get back and do this and that. Where I grew up, there's days where I had nothing to do, and my mom didn't want me in the house. And so I'd be in the backyard and starting to create different things, and you create scenarios and you bring a friend over. And by the end, you didn't want to be when it became dark, you didn't want to go inside. And I think the creativity that brings to you and to the situation is remarkable. I feel like that's a bit lost right now, and that's sad. And I think just social media and everything else just compounds it. So I don't know if I answered your question, but
I agree.
We're having these discussions with our kids.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Yeah, and same. And my kids are now 21 and 25, and we still have those conversations about trying to get some exposure in different areas and not just spend too much time on social media, and get out there and go to live concerts, go to the park, do whatever you're going to do, but get out from behind a screen,
Yes.
whether it's a handheld screen or an actual TV, either one. Because it's very easy to get sucked in and fall down that rabbit hole for a very, very long time. No, I agree. Well, so you mentioned a little while ago about if you had a chance to go back, you might do a couple things differently. So let's fast forward. So you and I are pretty similar in age. So let's say we're sitting down and having this conversation when we both turn 60. Luckily, it's a little ways down the road, but it's close enough.
Yes.
We're not ignoring it, right? So in that time frame, what would you want to kind of tell yourself then that you've learned now to make sure that you've maintained that balance over those years?
I think now, obviously you want to provide for your family, and there's, we're entering the college years, so that is important. However, I do think, kind of my job right now with the company I'm with is kind of like a perfect situation for me right now, because I'm really almost professional mentor internally. And I'm working with a lot of really great young salespeople in our organization, and helping them. They have a normal person that they work with in terms of management of sales management, but then I'm kind of an overlay, and I work with them and I help them specifically to network. I help them to get into larger organizations. I help them with questions. They can come to me with things that they may not want to go to their boss with. And I think, so 10 years from now, I would love to see them succeed. And I'd love to be able to say that I was a bit of part of it, not selfishly, but just to know that I was able to help them become the best versions of themselves, not only in their career, but also challenging them with many different things and be a resource for them. So I feel like for me, I like the early part of my career was very selfish in a sense, and for many reasons. But I do think that I'm at a career where right now, when you're in your 50s, early 50s, where you want to give back. And that's where I feel like that's my biggest reward with my job right now, being able to do that.
That's great. Yeah. And I think honestly, it's very few people can say that they weren't selfish in their early 20s in their career, because that's where you are in your life, right?
Right.
That's just part of that maturing process, if you will. But then you fast forward 30 years, right, where you and I are today in our early 50s, and it's different. You've learned a lot. You've got a lot more experiences under your belt. You've been married. You've raised kids. You're still raising kids. It just changes your whole perspective on things. I agree. And I know we didn't talk much about your role right now at Envoy Global, but you're involved in an organization that is really, again, focusing on the international market, right, with folks that are kind of in the immigration world, trying to immigrate to the U.S. and supporting them.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's kind of full circle. I feel like to me, this is kind of what I wanted to do 20 years ago in a similar career. So Envoy Global, we're an immigration services provider, an employment base. So we work with companies with their populations. So there's two components to it. One is inbound. So a lot of them are, especially with our client base, are STEM employees. So a lot of them are East Indian, Chinese, highly technical with PhDs and, computer science. And, if a company like, Apple wants to hire them, they need to be able to get a visa to be able to do that. So we help them facilitate getting the H-1B visas, the J-1s, and then help them with the whole green card process, because that's usually a perk and one of the things that companies will help them facilitate. So that's the inbound side where we help do that. And that's very rewarding. It's something that I took advantage of or didn't understand it, but I now realize how important that is to our economy, how important it is to the diversity of the workforce. And I feel like it's, we're really backwards in terms of our immigration policies in this country, but that's a separate thing. But I didn't really realize that going into it. And then the other component of our business is the outbound. So now if you get this great job with XYZ company and you have a 3-year assignment in Singapore, well, you can't just go. You need to get a visa. You need to get a whole process. And there's a whole support structure around that helps you do it. So that's what we do. And we have this amazing technology, because to move is probably one of the most stressful things you can do in your life. And that's even domestically. Now take your whole family and move to another country where you don't have the language, you don't have the support that you normally would have here. And it's a very scary endeavor. So I think what we do is help that process, and our technology gives visibility, because if you're waiting and your whole career is waiting to get this assignment, and it's 3 months you're waiting to get the visa from the consulate office and or the U.S. immigration. So we help that whole process, and then we help employers. It's all about, in the end, if an employee is productive, happy, they're productive at work. They're not worried about all the different things and where they're going to live and how are they going to do this and how do they do that. So that's the industry I'm in now, and I love it because it brought me back to international. And in our company, we're private equity funded and we're growing massively globally. So I think there'll be international travel more in my career, enough so that now that I have 3 teenage daughters, where I may want to leave the house.
Now the incentive is to not be there quite as much. That's pretty funny. Well, and I think, to your point a few minutes ago about, having a hand in helping people out. If you talk to them, 10 years from now, you may not talk to many of the folks that you're helping now, but just by the nature of what you're doing at Envoy, you are helping these folks. You're helping them to get set up in these foreign countries or to get set up here, and they're coming here for the first time, and to help them with their career and to get settled and to feel more comfortable and more at ease and more welcomed. And like you said, not having to worry about the mechanics and all of the documentation pieces, which can be, very distracting and very cumbersome as well. So it's nice that you have kind of a hand in that as well, although it may not be, as personal, but you definitely are impacting a lot of lives.
Yes.
That's great. Wonderful. Well, thank you. I mean, we have touched on a lot of different things, and there's other things that we could touch on, but it's really great to have the conversation and just hear about your journey, and the international flavor of your background and your life is it's really interesting. I think it'll be a really good discussion to follow back around on the next several years and see where it's taking you from here.
Well, it's a pleasure to be on your podcast. This is great. I think what you're doing is wonderful, and I can't wait to finish the book. So if we ever do talk again, I'll be able to let you know that I finished it and share my comments. But
great, I appreciate that. Yeah, and as we always say, I like to get the feedback, no matter if it's good or bad. It'll make me a better author for the next time.
Yeah. Thanks, Ken.
All right. Well, thanks, Greg. Take care.
Yeah, you too.
All right. Bye-bye.